How do we increase availability and enhance accessibility of intra-Africa trade and investment finance, and guarantee programs as well as facilitating payments between African traders? Now, this panel will also hopefully discuss issues related to maybe a pan-African payment and settlement system to facilitate those implementations of the AFCFTA, taking into consideration also new technology, which hasn't been touched on, the rise of Bitcoin, the rise of technology and e-commerce on the continent. So a lot to get through. Now, the subject matter is fiscal space, the AFCFTA fiscal space and financial sustainability for Africa. I'd like to go down down to my left and introduce our esteemed panel. I won't ask you to speak first because as lead speaker, Donald Kaberuka is going to speak first, but I will start with Mrs. Achatu Bolama Kane, who is the Minister of Planning, Republic of Niger. You're very welcome. Give her a round of applause, please. You're very welcome. She's doing a lot of interesting things in Niger, which she will illuminate for us in a moment. Next up is, of course, Donald Kaberuka, who's the Special Envoy, African Union Peace Fund. And of course, everyone in this room will know him also as the former president of the African Development Bank. Give Donald a round of applause, please. Let me make sure that I get this right. Next up is, I don't have you on my list, but next up is Emmanuel. 1 second, I don't have you on my list. Yes. Yes. Emmanuel Nadozier from ACBF. And finally, next to him is the Minister of Economy and Finance, also doing very interesting things. I just was in Morocco recently, Minister Mohamed Boussaid, who's the Minister of Economy and Finance for the Kingdom of Morocco. And finally, we have a real mixed bag on this panel because we have one of the most esteemed academics in economics, that's a professor of economics at University of Warwick, Heracles Polemarchakis, who is also joining us. Give all of them a round of applause before we begin. Now, I think what I'm going to do is begin, Donald, with you. The subject is one that the Executive Secretary, Vera Songwe, said was arguably, together with diversification, the most important thing to solve and find solutions, collective solutions, in order for this great dream of one market to become a reality. And that is, how do we deal with the fiscal space? How do we get financial sustainability and the instrument, tools, and policies needed to push this forward? Can I give you 5 minutes to be the lead speaker on this, and then I'll move down the panel.
All right. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. I want to thank Vera and the ECA for inviting me and for this choice of subject. And I want to thank all of you for being here and my panelists as well. So before I speak about fiscal space and fiscal issues, I have two side issues to raise. Moderator, if you agree.
Yes, go ahead.
One is an appeal and a request, which I've discussed with Vera already. Another is an observation, and then I come to fiscal space. I hope I can do that in 5 minutes. So, an appeal about this conference we're attending now. I've been attending these conferences for about 20 years. I attended the first one in 1997 as member of the government of Rwanda, and later as the president of the ADB. I've always thought that given the kind of excellent stuff we have in the ECA, the excellent products they give us, that we are not using this conference well enough. I don't think the solution is easy, but we need to find a way of making this conference more effective, more usable for us. Because the ECA is an excellent institution. We need a strong ECA. I think Vera said this morning that without ECA, we'll never have had the African Development Bank. They have excellent products. But I've always found that there's little traction people attending this conference. So I have the clearance of Vera to say this. I hope I'm not offending you, moderator, but it's very important. These conferences on the African space should not simply be about moving people from A to B. It should be actually about using this time well and making sure that we get most out of it. Now, I'm no longer a minister, so I have the luxury of appealing to find a solution, but I think we should find one. I know that many of you agree that is a space we can use much more effectively, like the AU finance ministers, like the ADB meetings. So that is my first appeal. It should not simply be a ritualistic, formalistic event we attend. So that's my first point. My second point is about the CFTA itself. A lot of things have been said this morning, but I thought I should say a couple of things, moderator. One of them, we should not consider the CFTA as simply a tariff reduction exercise. I think this morning the Commissioner for Trade made a very important point, that it should be about we undergoing a mind shift about what is going on in the continent. And to do so, I think that we need to address the fears of those who have a wait-and-see attitude, even address the cynics. So what are some of the fears I've heard or read in the general public's mind? One, there will be loss of revenues. There will be loss of jobs. Oh, we are a small economy. Oh, we are a big economy. There's no infrastructure. Regional economic communities will suffer. There's not enough safeguards. We fear dumping. I think as far as I'm concerned, negotiators have provided an answer for each of these fears in the way they've done it. But the CFTA is a gradualistic, sequenced exercise. How many people realize outside this room that liberalization applies actually to only 90% of the products? That we have got possibility for every country to say, this is a list of sensitive products which are not open. This is another list of products for which I need time. All these things are in the protocol. People speak as if it is 100% liberalization. It isn't. Second thing I think we should mention as we move around doing mobilization. Negotiators are still working on some additional issues. Dispute resolution, anti-dumping, the kind of things which every trade agreement must have. But let me say to this gathering that having anti-dumping laws has nothing to do with the CFTA. Because it is not African countries who will dump on each other. It is external countries which may dump in an African country. And so which means even by now, without a CFTA, we should be having anti-dumping regulations in our countries. It has nothing to do with the CFTA. But we need to have those regulations. So I think it is important as we go forward to be able to explain these things to the people, the business people, so that we have enough signatures by the end of the year. One more thing I should say, and I urge you to say loudly, I think it was mentioned this morning. CFTA is not simply about physical goods, merchandise. Almost half of the CFTA will be about services. It's about logistics, trade finance, insurance, telecommunication, data. All those things are part of the CFTA. So the idea that my manufacturers will suffer, well, they may not be manufacturers, but they're providing those services, including from some of the large countries who we still want to encourage to sign the CFTA. So I think all of us have work to do to explain what the CFTA is and what it is not, so that the fears which people have can be addressed. Now, one more thing. Why is the shift in mindset important? It is important because, as I've just mentioned, trade is no longer about moving merchandise from one place to another. It's accompanied by huge levels of services, the ones I've just mentioned. And in any case, tariffs, as we said in Kigali, are only half the problem. The big problem will be the non-tariff restrictions. These are the most political ones, the most difficult ones to deal with. And therefore, without a shift in our mindsets, it will be very hard to deal with non-tariff restrictions. So we need to bring in citizens, the general public, to understand that this thing will work for them and not against them. Two more small things, and I come to your fiscal space, because I know you love it. I've heard that regional economic communities will suffer. I want you to read carefully Article 21 of the CFTA, what it says, and two other articles. Whenever there is a conflict between the CFTA and regional economic community, and the level of trade in the community is higher than what the CFTA aspires to, then the rules of the regional community will apply. So actually, the CFTA builds on the regs and not the other way around. This we should explain. It's in Article 21 and two other articles. One more thing. Look at what happened at the ministerial meeting of WTO in Buenos Aires, the 11th ministers meeting. Total failure, no movement. We're a far cry from the Doha development round. So at the end of the day, even the global system on which we have been depending is no longer delivering. So we need the CFTA. If we didn't have one, we'd have to negotiate it, because WTO is no longer delivering. Now, I've read also something else. Well, these are signatures, but will the African countries deliver? My answer to this is that look carefully at the President of Rwanda's recommendation to his colleagues in the African Union. The number one recommendation is we have to deal with the crisis of implementation. So the CFTA we're adopting is closely linked with the AU reforms, and the two have to succeed simultaneously. And I have no doubt that this time round we'll get it correctly. A small thing, I don't know if you allow me, on the African Union.
I was actually going to ask you to elaborate on the EU reforms.
Thank
and
you.
what are you asking people to do?
Then you have to give me more than 5 minutes.
I will give you another 2 minutes and 32 seconds. No, something like that.
No, but let me limit myself to the part of the air reform I'm most familiar with, which is the financing. So what is the issue with the financing? And here are finance ministers or their representatives. What is the problem? There are four. Issue number one is that our organization has become too dependent on the outside world. So fact number one. Fact number two, even inside Africa, it has become too dependent on a few countries. So dependence number two. Number three, the AU has so much duplication with regional communities and other Pan-African organizations, there is neither visibility and comparative advantage or the means to assume all those responsibilities. And so the aim is to say, focus, focus, and ensure division of labor. One more thing, which I think is an issue for the AU, is that it has assumed in recent years a very costly, expensive exercise, which is peacekeeping and peace support operations, for which it gets little support from outside. So I want to urge finance ministers who are here, take advantage of the organ you have been given, which is the F-15, where the heads of state are asking you to handle all these issues yourselves. And I want to commend the work you are doing, including the minister from Morocco here. Now, the formula for funding the union. At lunch, I was sitting next to the governor of the Bank of England with Vera, Bank of Ireland, who spoke to us this morning. The formula for funding the African Union, which has been put forward, is exactly the same way the European Union has been funding itself. I want to repeat this. The famous 0.2% is exactly the same approach which the European Union used to fund itself, plus a bit of the VAT. So it has got an antecedent. Now, some countries have said, well, we cannot do this because of WTO, because it will be discriminating from outside countries. Now you have got the CFTA. From the moment you have the CFTA, there's no longer a conflict between the funding formula and international treaties and obligations. I want this to be clear. But in any case, even under the old formula, right now the AU is struggling. Countries are not paying small amounts of money, even those who can pay. So I'm hoping at least out after this conference, before we meet in workshop, that every country will go back, try to ensure that we pay up what you owe to the African Union. That will be the test that this meeting has been useful. So now let me, 2 minutes on fiscal space. I'll be very brief. So here is what has been said this morning and earlier. That in the next 30 years, because of the demographics, we have something called a demographic dividend. Fine. I think what we're discussing now is the implications from a financial viewpoint, what that implies. The fiscal stress that will be implied in terms of expenditure on education and health, infrastructure, and housing. So there will be two choices. Either we can meet these funding sustainably, or we do so by creating fiscal crisis. I think we don't have a option choice. We'll have to do it sustainably. And I suggest we do so by 4 ways, and I'll stop there. Number one, we need to grow our economies. We need to be less dependent on foreign aid, with foreign aid being used only for leveraging and blind finance. Third, we need to rely more on domestic resource mobilization. There is still a possibility of raising revenues by anywhere between 3 and 5% of GDP, and that is a lot. Every country can increase the revenues. Now, the countries who fear revenue losses by the CFTA should see what has happened in COMESA countries when they brought down the tariffs. Actual revenues went up, not down. The second thing we have to do is to spend our money quite well. I think I don't have to say much about this, but I want to emphasize that one thing which the CFTA gives us is that the competition for investment, where all of us give tax breaks, thereby undermining the revenue base, will be minimized. So we'll have more space to spend, and we have to do so efficiently. I can mention this point later if you want. The third, which has been mentioned, is about commodities and complex products. I don't have to belabor the point, it has been said. The fourth, and before the last point, is on debt. And here, because of what I've heard in the last 2 days, I want to spend just half a minute. We have indeed to avoid debt traps. But avoiding debt traps does not mean you have to avoid capital markets. International financial organizations are now raising alarm all over the place. Africa is going through a debt crisis. Permit me to express a more nuanced view. It is true that there are 14 countries who are going into worrisome territory, but 40 countries are still in green territory, and they are still able to access capital markets. Number two, all these alarms are being raised by people citing a figure, debt to GDP. My view is that it is not necessarily the right metric. Do you know why? There's a country in Central America, no names, which defaulted with a debt to GDP of 27%. So you can default at any level of debt to GDP, depending upon things I'm going to mention. So access capital markets, but you have to ensure that the other dynamics are in place. So you have to ensure that the speed in which the stocks build up are under control. You have to watch currency and maturity mismatches. You have to look at debt governance, debt transparency. You have to look at debt management, which I think the ECA can help to improve the accounting, the monitoring, the data around these debts, and also the market dynamics. I mean, our countries have been accessing capital markets, and to be sad, if because of 1 or 2 countries who are not handling this right, we begin to ourselves censure ourselves, which we can do wisely if you watch the macroeconomic management. Now, I think I've spoken for too long, so I want to conclude by saying that I'm not by any means saying that there's no risk of a debt trap. I'm only saying that it is not a foregone conclusion, it is not necessary. There's a way we can access capital markets intelligently. We have strategies, debt management capacity, investing well, ensuring that there is no mismatch, too big a mismatch between both the maturities and investments and the currencies. All these things the ECA can help you do it. So it's about going back to our countries and looking at our debt strategies, not suddenly going to a switch on and off in terms of access to capital markets at a time when the markets are still soft and have not hardened up enough. So with the CFTA, I'm convinced we can expand the fiscal space to fund education, to fund the health infrastructure, before we come to this demographic cliff, if I can use this for lack of a better word. But I'm happy to come back. I want my colleagues to speak. But this is my understanding of what we're discussing today.
Let's thank Donald for that. That was a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much. So much to chew on, and I will ask the other panelists, can we make this the least well-behaved panel of all the panels today? So don't really stay in your box. Listen to what everybody else says, intervene, and let's have a conversation rather than statements, because there's some, I've got an embarrassment of riches here in terms of the quality of the minds when it comes to when it comes to these issues. So let's mix it up. Now, you've mentioned a lot of things there, Donald. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot to consider. This is a brave new world, and we're trying to make sense of it as it's moving. But time does not stand still for us to put things in place for the CFTA. You still have to do your day job. So if you're a minister of finance or a minister of planning, you still have to figure out how to create your development strategy and how to execute that. That's exactly what the lady to my left has to deal with every day at work. She's writing a development strategy in what is a budget-constrained environment. She's having to look at scarce resources, and she's got to make very difficult and decisions, and they've got to be the right decisions, not just for the current environment, but for the changing environment that we've been discussing. So without much ado, I'll hand over to the Minister of Planning, Republic of Niger. Madame, you have the floor. I said 5 minutes, but Donald took longer, so you can take longer. No, it's fine.
Merci beaucoup. Je suis très contente de parler.
I'm very happy to speak after Mr. Kabirou. He knows such a lot about the problems of Africa. Somebody who has presided the African Development Bank. I think we've got the right person who really knows what the challenges are that our countries are facing. He began his statement by saying something that I'm also going to stress. It's possible, if it's not in the resolutions or recommendations, that we should have this in like this. The ECA. It's our organisation. The ECA gives us a lot of support in our strategies. I'm speaking about strategies today, but in the formulation of these strategies, I've got a lot from the ECA. We have the privilege of hosting the West African headquarters for the ECA, and we know how useful it is. At the present time, with this process of the CFTA which has been launched, the ECA is more useful than ever for our countries. I had a discussion with Vera Songwe yesterday, and I said, Madam, in Niger I have a problem. I'm going to get into the CFTA, but today I exported my onions to Côte d'Ivoire, to Ivory Coast. But then they are processed by the Netherlands? What can the CFTA do for me? What are the reasons that mean that my onions are more expensive than the ones that come from the Netherlands? Why is my meat from Niger? Why does this have to walk to be consumed? Which means that it's more expensive than that's imported from Brazil. That's the problem. These are the questions that we have to look at as African countries when we're getting into what I think is an irreversible process. As Mr. Amadouba said before, there's really no choice about this. So this is the kind of question, specific questions, where the ECA is really helpful to us. It's not a question of just having recommendations and resolutions to say to the ECA, do this, do that, but we have to have a situation where our states take account of the ECA and what they say in their strategies to guide their strategies. This is very important. Each of our countries with the ECA draws up a profile for it. There's a country profile each year, and I think it's important to know this and to be aware of it. Going back to what Mr. Kaberuka said on the CTFA itself, the CTFA is a process. The CTFA is a process which will proceed in a progressive manner, looking at the pros and cons for our countries, and we adapt. We have to bear in mind that in the negotiation process for the CTFA, there were principles which we looked at to start off with. He reminded us that the regional communique is a pillar of the CTFA. We're already in an economic community and we're advancing together. This is also the case for ECOWAS, where we in Niger are in this, and this is the basis that we're taking to construct our CTFA. We have to safeguard what we have acquired. And we adapt the situation in accordance with our countries. So we have a flexibility, a differentiated approach. And this is a principle. So there are a certain number of principles. I'm not going to go through them all, but they're very important. And they shouldn't prevent our countries, they should help our countries to be encouraged to get involved in the CTFA. I think at the present time, as well as Rwanda and Kenya and Ghana, Rwanda and Niger are going to ratify, and I think that these 4 countries, their example should be followed so that in 9 months' time, all the 44 countries can do this. And I think that this is very important so that we can make progress. So we are committed to moving towards the CTFA. I would really like to express thanks here to the President, Yusuf Mohamedou, and the whole team, because certainly they're the CTFA champions for Africa, but a champion has to have a strong team behind them. And that strong team is the ECA through Vera Songwe and the ad hoc committee, which was set up in order to do this work. I think we should thank them for this, and I would like to renew the thanks of the President of Niger. In Niger, we have defined our sustainable development and inclusive growth strategy, integrating already our commitments, because Agenda 2063 is a commitment. Agenda 2030 is an international commitment that we contributed to. The African countries have done a great deal of work so that our interests should be taken account of. So these agendas are our agendas. These agendas have to be translated into our strategies, and that's what we've done in our sustainable development strategy. Even more than this, for the first 5 years of the strategy, we've translated that into an economic and social development plan. And that's what I'm looking at. All of the problems which might come up from the fact of us being committed to the CTFA, we're organising ourselves so that this should be more of a strength than a weakness for us. We have an economy which
and that's the rural part of the world. And we also have private investment. And this is working very well, I would say. Our option is to say that we will work on our weaknesses to increase our strengths. And I think that's what we should be doing. Our first pillar for growth is transformation of the rural world. 80%, 40% of our GDP would be enough to be a lever for growth. Why is that? Because investing in the rural sector through increasing production and productivity and taking charge of water and setting up energy infrastructure and improving our road infrastructure will boost the growth in the rural sector. Furthermore, the private sector. If we could make sure that our business climate can be as encouraging as possible, we can be proud of making business and making notable progress across our continent. We are determined to work in this way to transform our economies so that we have economies that create wealth and growth that's inclusive for our populations, but also is able to work within the CFTA. We're speaking about budgetary space. In Niger, we have opted for 60% of our public budget, our public purse, by 2021 to come from internal resources and only 40% from external resources. And the external resources are much more towards gifts rather than taking on debt. So these 60% have to be found. And that's why in the case of Rwanda, Mr. Amodoba, we have certain constraints that we have set ourselves. I believe I saw him come into the room. We are seeking to set up a harmonized system of public budget and mobilize internal resources in our countries. And in order to do this, we have to commit to reform, and quite arduous reforms, quite stringent reforms. In January 2017, we concluded an agreement with the IMF where we took some commitments in this regard. Our objective by 2020 and 2021 is to have much lower fiscal increase in our budgets. I will stop just here, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them afterwards. We have therefore given ourselves the means so that we do not end up in CFTA with problems of mobilization of resources, so that we can create the conditions so that these internal resources can be mobilized. And I can give you the exact ways in which we intend to do this, but that will depend on the questions that I'm asked. Thank you.
give her a round of applause, please. I'm sure what we're going to do is once we've gone down the line, we'll probably just have some time to take some questions. I'm sure there are some people in the audience that want to come back to you with questions. So without much ado, protocol dictates that I have to, and I'm sure the good professor doesn't mind, Professor Emmanuel, that I skip straight to, I go further north from Niger, up to Morocco, and go to your fellow minister, the Minister of Economy and Finance in the Kingdom of Morocco. I don't know how many people here have had the opportunity to go to Morocco recently. I was in Casablanca, finance city, being hosted by the stock exchange there. It's quite remarkable, the plans that Morocco is putting in place in terms of its fiscal reforms, in terms of its national planning. But now, of course, it has to embrace this concept of a one market. So without much ado, the subject we're talking about is looking into the future about a more robust fiscal space and financial sustainability for Africa, across Africa. So I'm going to ask the minister to wear two hats, as a Pan-African and as a Moroccan, and maybe 5 or 10 minutes or so talk about these matters. Go ahead, Minister.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Mark. Excellencies, Madam Vera Songwe, Executive Secretary of the ECA, Excellencies, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, I am extremely happy to be with you today to speak to you about the work of my country at the ECA. I would like to welcome the efforts always made by the ECA. What can I say? I had prepared a brief speech, but I believe that many of the things I was going to say have been said since this morning, particularly during the preceding session, where we spoke about the AFCFTA. The CFTA is a structural project which requires the goodwill of all heads of state and which will no doubt be beneficial for speeding up economic growth for African countries, for the private sector, for the people, even if there are challenges and questions. We heard from Madam Aishatou Kane from Niger, and perhaps there will be some questions that we can ask her after I have spoken. We were hoping that there was going to be the signature for the CFTA with the European Union. For you it's tomatoes, for us it's onions. I'm very happy to be with you today, that our continent has taken this very important step through the signature of the AFCFTA. The conclusion of this agreement is a milestone, a historic milestone for a prosperous and united Africa, which the one that we all want. This event is even more striking since it comes at a watershed moment for our continent. Our economic model, our strategies for development, our public policies have been put in question as we look at a global crisis without precedent, and as we are on the threshold of digitalization, which requires extra efforts from us, from all of our governments, and of course to meet the aspirations of our people. The volatility of the rates of exchange that this crisis has brought with it in its wake has meant that the viability of our budgets, our external budgets, in many of our larger countries have been confronted by a diversification that is not sufficient of its productivity and more exports of primary commodities. The AFCFTA is an opportunity. It's a great opportunity because it will allow us to increase exports and growth of the African continent through the emergence of an industrialized basis. I believe that intra-African trade currently is less than 15%. But when we look at integrated unions, market unions, the one market, the regional markets, goes beyond 50, even 60%, and in some places 66%. So there's an enormous potential for intra-African trade, which will be allowed through this AFCFTA. Another impact will be a reduction of the shocks caused on exchange terms, since we will be less dependent on outside sources for the value of our commodities. And a third consequence will be the promotion of the logistical networks to facilitate trade, which will allow the continent to catch up in many ways. And where we are the most concerned, it will allow us to be able to provide jobs and make sure that they're better remunerated, and this will be value added for us. The theme of finding fiscal space for this, which is at the heart of this session, Mr. Kaberuka shared many extremely interesting ideas from his experience as ex-president, former president of the ADB. But all finance ministers will be faced with the issue of the impact on their budgets, their revenues, by the entry into force of the AFCFTA to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the importance, the size of their economies, the impact in a general way, which will be measured, which can be measured, can be mitigated by particular specificities, and they can come into place at the right speed. There will be variable geometries, if you will, over the future negotiations. However, I believe that the benefits of the CFTA are extremely important, and the starting point, from my point of view, should not be focused, and that's what's important, what are we going to win and what are we going to lose? Because once we start saying what are we going to win or what are we going to lose, then that's the end. There is no choice. There is no choice, as Mr. Amadou Ba said. We will all win. We will all win as long as we have the right measures to go along with the way in which we implement the CFTA. I say this to you because Morocco has signed, as I said before, an agreement with the European Union, with the United States, with a certain number of other groupings. And it's true that the impact on our revenues, particularly at the customs, is there and can be seen. The impact on the productive fabric is there. And what we have to do, and this is what's been done, is to find investment so that we are able to integrate the sectors which are visible, to have sectoral practices which are clear and sectoral practices which are ambitious to attract foreign investment. You said it, Madam. We have to improve our ways of doing business, to find partners, partnerships, public-private partnerships, involve the private sector so that they can participate in the financing of some expenditure, particularly, for example, in infrastructure. And to go back to what was said by one of the preceding speakers, there are ways that we should explore in order to mitigate the impacts. The first idea is the strengthening of fiscal administration through its modernization, the improvement of governance of the mining companies, the taxation for financial transactions, the elimination of non-strategic fiscal taxations, and using ways of imposing taxes. I believe that there are enormous possibilities in the fiscal space, and with the customs, particularly as we move towards the digital space. The other point, and this was said by Mr. Kabaruka, and I believe that must be the third time I've made a reference to him, because he's our guide, our mentor, our reference point. We're not talking about collecting revenue only. We're talking about ways of improving our expenses, our public purse. So the mobilization of resources and planning for development are able to work hand in hand. At the same time, we have administrative reforms, turning to the private sector and involving them, because the CFTA must be done in the context of maintaining, insofar as possible, the macroeconomic balance. We shouldn't have the entry into force of the CFTA creating an imbalance. There has to be the sustainability of financing the economy and sustainability, and this is going to be in my last point, this will be the conclusion to my points, sustainability of our debt. We have to explore the possibilities of debt, but to have the debt targeted towards the productive investment that will allow us to use this as a lever to attract more investment without placing in danger our public budget would be better. Over the last few years, we have a law on finance which has a golden rule which affects all of the supplements to debt exclusively relating to investment. And I think that that means that that can be a safeguard so that debt can be sustainable. To conclude, I would like to say that beyond the economic undeniable advantages, CFTA should give African citizens a feeling of pride to belong to a global bloc where the production factor will be a powerful vector for improvement of conditions of life for many Africans who today are confronted by social exclusion and the vagaries of poverty. Thank you.
Minister from the Kingdom of Morocco, a lot to chew on there: strengthening of fiscal administration and monetary policy, achieving an economic diversification, macroeconomic balance of sustaining the economy. The economy is ticking over. You've got to manage your debt prudently. You gave us a lot to think about. But I just so happen to have an extra professor in my pocket to your right, actually, right to your right. Yeah, you're on his professor sandwich at the moment. You don't know which way to turn. We were not expecting him on this panel, but we're glad he's here. That's why I stumbled a little bit when I was going down my line. But I'm so glad you're here, Professor Emmanuel Nandozi, who's the Executive Secretary of the African Capacity Building Foundation. And their tagline is, Africa capable of achieving its own development. Amen to that, my brother. Now we have the AFCFTA. I'll give you 5 minutes. The subject matter is fiscal space and financial sustainability in the world of AFCFTA.
Thank you very much, Chair. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. I thank the ECA, led by Dr. Vera Songwe, for inviting me. This subject is a very important one, and I'm glad that I'm speaking after mon grand frère, Donald Kabaruka, because he more or less has really given us the most important background for us to discuss. On the specific issue of fiscal space and financial sustainability, I just have a few words to say. I think the agreement has really captured this issue in a very, very strong and very, very meaningful way, especially when it comes to the issues of tariff reduction and the fears that are relating to those kinds of things. But more fundamentally, the issue of fiscal space and financial sustainability is something that relates to domestic resource mobilization. And in this particular case, this is a two-way or bi-directional relationship between revenue mobilization and the CFTA. So much so that on the one hand, higher domestic revenues, if they are mobilized, will really provide the resources to support the implementation of the CFTA. On the other hand, as has been illustrated and spoken about by many, many presenters, The CFTA itself will promote the mobilization and of resources that are more sustainable, that can be used for social spending and for development exercises across the board. So if this is the case, therefore, should we just simply think that given that the studies that have been done by those who have really analyzed this, in particular the ECA, that has shown that the fear about revenue losses is probably exaggerated. In other words, that the net gains or net benefits will, is what will really result, especially in the medium to long term. And the argument here is that if you create the CFTA, it will really help to create a more sustainable fiscal base, because there'll be hopefully more industrialization, more diversification, and economic growth in general, which is really something that positively correlates with revenue mobilization. And also for economists to moving away from the excessive dependence on natural resource or extractive sectors as sources of their revenue. So, in other words, we need to do a lot of things, and the Honorable Minister from Morocco has really highlighted them, so I won't go through the things that will help to expand the tax base. But the most important thing here is CFTA or no CFTA, there's still a lot of effort that has to be made to mobilize domestic resources, especially strengthening the tax administrations, fighting illicit financial flows, and doing all sorts of things. Now, I think everybody agrees that the idea of the CFTA, the African CFTA, is a good one. And by the way, it is not a new idea, because even the Abuja Treaty does, is something that was mooted there. So it's not something that is just happening. But we're glad that at least there's some motion in making it a reality. But let me pause here to raise a bit of some concern and alarm. And I think the chair has told us to be a bit provocateur. So, if the African Capacity Building Foundation did a study in 2014, and we produced a document called the Digest of OAU/AU Treaties, Conventions, and Agreements from 1963 to 2014. And this publication is available to anybody who wants it. What did we find out? By August 2013, 42 treaties and agreements have been signed by African member states of the OAU and AU. But only 25 had been ratified. From 2002 to 2018, 51 treaties had been signed, but 31 of them are yet to be, which about 60% were yet to be ratified. And for those that have been ratified, it took on average about 5 years for the ratification to happen. These are not encouraging figures. At least I wanted to put this on the table just to illustrate the amount of work that needs to be done. I'm very glad that some mechanisms have been put in place, and there's strong advocacy, especially the champions led by the President of Niger, plus all the other institutions that are supporting that mechanism. This is what you need for this thing to happen. But keep in mind that ratification is just the beginning. To make sure that the thing benefits, or the maximum benefit is really exploited by countries. It means therefore that the implementation dimension is going to be accelerated and done in an expeditious manner. But the issue here is, if we look at the record, it's not very, very, very encouraging, but I think it can be done. And the example of the 4 countries that are in the front line now is extremely encouraging. And I'm not trying to minimize that 44 countries have already signed. I think this is extremely encouraging. This is a very positive sign. But we need a lot of work to get to the 22 that will make this, that's the number that's being sought after right now. Again, if you look at the countries themselves, many countries have fantastic development strategies. And over the years, we have seen different kinds of continental agenda. But the reason why we're still talking about Agenda 2063 and the SDGs is because these very good strategies have not really resulted in the development outcomes that are desirable. And we have really done some study on this to realize that it's not always an issue of political will, nor is it simply the issue of lack of resources, but that capacity is at the center of this problem. The central issue is capacity deficiencies and lack of capacity in general. And so the point we're making here is, if you want the CFTA to really work, in addition to putting in place the right policies, the right environment, making the right investment, you need to, number one, have a strategy. Number two is you have to create the institutional arrangement that will make this work. And number three is that you have to really develop the private sector. This is not, because this is what is going to drive the whole agenda. And for you to do all those things, you really need to be able to have the capacity to implement. Some of them are CFTA specific capacities, and some of them are composite capacities that will require you to have the sort of leadership that will push this agenda, have the sort of institutions that are critical for this to happen, and have the men and women, the human capital, the expertise that are going to drive the agenda. And so what we have done at ACBF is to try to assist the countries in doing especially some, depending on sectoral or national capacity needs assessment. And based upon this, we together develop the strategies and plans for implementing them. And everybody else can chip in and help in building these capacities. And we intend to prioritize the capacity related to the CFTA for the countries that may need it, because there's need to really do some work at the country level, at the regional level, and at the continental level. So, although I did give some bad news in terms of the continent's ability to really ratify and implement agreements, but I think this is just something that we should keep in mind, that should spur us to move in a much more, in a stronger way and in a much more determined way to make sure that this CFTA works. Thank you very much, Chair.
Mr. Edo, I think we have to move a little bit faster. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to mention, you mentioned countries. The AFCFTA index, it has been developed. This is a new tool to measure how well countries are going to be doing in implementing the AFCFTA. This is a tool being created by ECA at the moment, and it is going to be launched very soon. So please ask your contacts at the ECA about it. We'll be discussing it, of course, the next time we're in this room next year. That will be very high on the agenda. Now I'll move from one professor to the next, and thank you very much for your patience. Herakles Polemarchakis is the professor of economics at the University of Warwick. Now, the subject we're talking about is fiscal space and financial sustainability. And I want you to talk about some of the theories and experiences of countries like your country, Greece, your Greek, the importance and the relevance of fiscal policy and economic diversification. But could you squeeze in a thought about a worry that some people, some finance ministers, some countries might have about the constraints put on policymakers by membership of a trade union of one market, what that might mean based on the experiences you've seen?
Thank you very much. So I want to thank you all for the opportunity to participate, to listen, to learn. I want to thank the organizers, in particular Dr. Songwe, Vera, for giving me the chance, as I said, to listen, to learn. I'm not a policymaker, and hope to contribute a little bit to the discussion. Allow me to say a few words about why I'm here, because I think this will, why I think I've been given this opportunity. And I want to do this to put in perspective what I have to say. As was mentioned, I'm an academic. I do economics, and I work on the theory of monetary and fiscal policy. But in addition, I wore for a while another hat. I don't wear it anymore, because I was, during difficult times, a member of the team of economic advisors of the Prime Minister of Greece at the time that the crisis broke out in 2009. So I think I shall try to mix comments and remarks coming from these two perspectives. Now what happened? Probably everybody knows more or less what happened in the case of Greece, which I think can be credited, at least in quotes, for igniting the European debt crisis. Other countries were involved. It is true that Iceland was a problem that broke out earlier, but that was a problem of much more limited scope. There were elections in Greece in the fall 2009. A new government took over, and by December 2009, it was clear that access to capital markets was rapidly closing, with spreads skyrocketing, and immediately setting off discussions of assistance, to Greece asking for assistance, either from the European Union or from the IMF or from both. The decision was made. I think the European governments played a role in insisting that the IMF be involved, and Greece applied for a special arrangement, if I'm getting the terminology correct. It was the first one for the IMF for two reasons. Not only because of the magnitude, which was by factors of thousands more than Greece would have been normally entitled to, but because it was the first time that the IMF went into a program not alone, but jointly with with somebody else, in this case, the European Union. Now, the first program was followed by a second one, and Greece is now on the third program. As a matter of fact, the third program is about to be over, and the participation or not of the IMF in this third program is still under discussion. It's a bit strange that the program is about to end, and whether the IMF is participating or not is still not decided. Greece is coming out in August from this third adjustment program, and in what sense it is coming out with a balanced budget. That is, the budget has a primary surplus, with some deregulation that has taken place, but it is coming out as a severely wounded country, and the future, the least that one can say, is uncertain. During these 9 years, the country lost 25% of its domestic product, unemployment rose to 25%, it is now down to 20, but it peaked at 25, and the debt, the sustainability of the debt, is still being debated between the IMF and the European partners. It's still well above 150% of GDP. Now, one can ask, what went wrong? Why wasn't the program more of a success? And what lessons can be drawn from it? I think the program was not that a success because it focused on the following two dimensions. One dimension was balance the budget, and the other was deregulate. Now, balancing the budget, or austerity, if that's another word for this set of policies, I think, involves a contradiction. And the contradiction is the following. Why does a country have indebtedness problems? It has indebtedness problems because it does not manage to produce enough to sustain the standard of living that it has been enjoying or that it would like to enjoy. But if you want to develop the capacity to develop your productive sector, whatever that may be, it can be services, it can be agriculture, it can be whatever, that is a time that you need investments in order to do this. So austerity closes the door. There can be structural reforms that are costless, but our costless structural reforms cannot be that extensive. So in some sense, imposing austerity prevents the country from ever getting over the need for help from abroad. That's the contradiction that I see in austerity programs naively applied, as it was in the case of Greece. There have been discussions that the minister from Morocco mentioned that productive investment, that when one does the accounting for debts and deficits, productive investment should probably, or one could consider doing the accounting differently. It was not done in the case of Greece, and the consequences have been disastrous. Now, the educational system, in particular higher education, is in tatters. Now, ideological components have also played a negative role in this, but let's not talk about that. The fact of the matter is that there has been a mass exodus of human capital from Greece to Western Europe. And that is hurting right now, and it's going to hurt in the medium run, it's going to hurt in the long run, unless something is done to reverse it. So one aspect of the program was balance the budget, and the other, of course, was deregulation, opening markets. Now, I do not want to deny the incentives that markets provide. I do not want to deny the control that markets serve to put in place. Nevertheless, I think that markets cannot simply be left unregulated. It is not the case that it suffices to open markets and forget about economic policy, forget about regulation. Now, unfortunately, the adherence to the free market mantra, which we do hear still on today, have followed a policy which has been very effective. I believe it was Krishna Menon, when he was foreign secretary in India, whose negotiating technique was supposed to have been very simple. He would induce his interlocutors to repeat their points time and again without his saying anything. And after they repeated their points a number of times, they would start themselves questioning what they were saying, and then he would pass on the attack. So there are people who understand that markets need to be regulated, but the ideology of free markets, and that's all we have to do, still seems to carry the day. And I think this is problematic. And I would like to close with one more consideration: issues of distribution and inequality. There have been huge political developments in Western countries recently. One can think of the United States, one can think of Germany, one can think of Italy, and almost France. Now, one tries to understand why, what has brought about this change, and the consensus seems to be that large segments of the population feel left out, that inequality is rising, and this is a problem that markets are not addressing effectively. I think it should be in the agenda for both policymakers and academic economists to address both the causes and consequences of inequality, and that's something that markets alone cannot do, even if they are not at the cause of it.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you. Give him a round of applause. Now, if the chair of the Bureau will permit, I'd like to take 3 very quick questions, and we'll be very quick in answering them because we're more or less out of time. So if you have a question, fastest fingers first, please raise your country sign, and who's going to be first? We'll take 3 questions. If there are 3 questions here, who is that brave person who's going to raise first? Chad? Chad, please ask your question.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you, moderator. First of all, I'd like to thank the panelists and congratulate them on the clarification they have shed on the topic. My question relates to the strength of the free trade zone. Africa has been rather split up amongst agreements throughout the continent. When we hear people stressing the agreements that some areas have with the EU, the ACP, part of Africa has these agreements, whereas other countries, Maghreb, have the good neighbourship agreement with the EU. Perhaps other people have other agreements. So we wonder what will be really the strength of the CFTA if Africa already has a number of agreements with partners elsewhere. So that's my very brief question, and we might have other questions subsequently. Thank you.
Thank you, our brother from Chad. Now moving to Gambia. Gambia has a question.
Thank you. And I'll join others also in thanking the panelists for the wonderful presentations. Now, we've seen in sub-Saharan Africa, like I said before, debt is rising. And also it was seen that quality of expenditure fell.
Can I ask a little bit close to your microphone, because we can't really hear you.
I was saying, we've seen that in sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen that debt is rising, and also we've seen that quality of public investment also fell in many countries. We've seen new challenges also emanating from fiscal risks of state-owned enterprises. This is also a challenge in some countries. And we've seen many countries also are in the situation of debt distress. Now, given this circumstance, I believe there will be concern relating to sustainability, fiscal sustainability in the future. If you have a situation where debt is rising, quality of public investment falling, and state-owned enterprises risks are rising. Financial sector also, they took government papers and they are now exposed to the public sector. So my question is maybe to the professor, what kind of reforms would you recommend to these kind of countries? Is it to take the bullet, that is good, do it swiftly, or to take a gradualist approach in this circumstance? Because we know reforms also, you have to do it in such a way that it doesn't hurt growth. But at the same time, if you are too gradual on it, the public might start revolting against it, and this might also affect the outcome of your reforms. So I would want to know what kind of reforms you would recommend in this circumstance. Thank you.
Okay, my esteemed panel, let me just run through as I could hear, because it was a bit difficult to hear him. But the first question was from a gentleman from Chad, and it was questioning the strength of the zone. He's wondering if the AFCFTA, how it comfortably sits with existing agreements. And then our friend from Gambia talked about some of the challenges that African countries are facing. Debt is rising in some countries. The quality of public investment is falling in many countries. And so there's a concern about fiscal sustainability. So he's asking to paint a picture of what kind of reforms could be put in place to counter that, but reforms that don't hurt growth, but then again are not too slow so they don't work. So maybe Donald.
I will take on the second one. I'll leave the first one to the minister from Morocco. Let me make a distinction between two types of debt. There is a debt within a currency union, which is the case of Greece. When you belong to a currency union, that was their particularity. And that when you are not within a currency union. I think what you are referring to here is the debt if you are not in the currency union, because we are not in the currency union. I think for me, what are the reforms which are required? These are not rocket science. Reform number one, what is the international organizations are worried about is not so much the stock of the debt at the moment. It is about the speed with which debt has increased. Debt servicing costs have increased almost 3 times in the last 5 years. So it is a concern that the accumulation of debt is happening very, very fast when the countries don't have the infrastructure to decide how well to invest, and they don't have enough debt management capacity, whether it is external debt or internal debt. The second issue is about debt transparency and debt governance. And so put this together in a context of poor planning of investment, then you could have a fiscal crisis. Now, I did mention a country in Central America which had a debt default. The stock of debt was not big, it was 28%. The country was Ecuador. Debt to GDP was 27%, very, very low. But they defaulted and they had a fiscal crisis because debt management capacity was very poor, all right? And I suspect debt governance too was an issue. So I'm not making this proposal today, but if I was still in office, I would certainly propose that at this point in time, we think about the possibility of having independent debt management offices. Independent debt management offices, perhaps with the same independence as the central banks. And this would then build the capacities for us to have debt strategies which enable us to access capital markets safely. The second thing which I think about on debt is that there are rules, golden rules of debt. You borrow carefully, you invest wisely, and you make sure you have debt management capacity. But if you borrow in dollars, all right, and you increase public expenditure now on recurrent revenues, clearly you're going to have a problem. But if you match your investments and your borrowing over time, clearly you can find a way of managing it over time. It is important to emphasize also that internal debt can be a problem because internal debt crowds out private investment, it increases rates of interest, and therefore steals jobs. So I was hoping that we can look at the debt not simply in terms of one metric, debt to GDP ratio, but debt within an entire macroeconomic construct, which I think I'm trying to argue. But to Greece, that was a different proposition. They are within a currency union, the euro. There are issues for which I'm not very competent, except I have looked carefully at the issue of Greece and Ireland and Portugal. And I'm hoping that the day we have a currency union, we learn from those lessons. But this is what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Donald. For the final word, I'll go to the Honourable Minister from Morocco.
Je vais répondre relativement rapidement. Les pays d'Afrique ont des situations différentes parce qu'effectivement, il y a des pays qui ont des accords avec d'autres ensembles économiques. Et à l'intérieur, d'ailleurs, du continent, il y a aussi des pays qui font partie d'un ensemble économique où il y a des accords de libre-échange, des accords douaniers. Donc tout ça a été pris en charge dans le cadre de l'accord de libre-échange continental. Au niveau de la progressivité, parce que l'accord est signé au niveau, bien entendu, du principe. Après, il y a la mise en œuvre va prendre du temps, parce qu'il y aura la progressivité donc de la mise en œuvre. Donc, ce qu'a appelé Madame la ministre, c'est la géométrie variable. Donc, tout ça, c'est pris en compte. Il y a les règles d'origine qui vont être prises en compte. Je ne veux pas rentrer dans les techniques. Puisque l'occasion m'est donnée, j'ai omis de parler d'une idée dans mon intervention, c'est que la zone de libre-échange continentale est la manifestation éclatante du développement du multilatéralisme. Ce multilatéralisme doit être soutenu par des relations bilatérales approfondies dans le cadre de l'esprit de la coopération sud-sud tel que promu par Sa Majesté le roi Mohamed VI, qui à travers les nombreuses visites qu'il a effectuées au niveau des pays d'Afrique, avec les nombreux accords de coopération qui ont été signés, représente cette approche bilatérale représente à mon sens un socle important de renforcement donc, du multilatéralisme. Et dernier point, puisque Marc a parlé de Casablanca et je le remercie des mots gentils qu'il a eus à l'égard de mon pays, je voudrais profiter de cette occasion pour deux choses. Réitérer mes remerciements à Madame Veras-Kounro, la secrétaire exécutive de la CEA, pour son leadership et nous féliciter ensemble pour la réussite de la 51e réunion de la CEA ici à Addis et nous donner l'occasion et vous proposer, disons, suggérer à ce que la 52e deuxième réunion de la CEA puisse se tenir au Maroc, le Maroc qui se propose donc d'accueillir la prochaine édition. Merci.
Thank you very much. Could I ask all of you to rise, please? Could you stand up, please? Could I ask all of you to say thank you for a wonderful panel? Put your hands together, please. And now, thank you.
I'd like to thank Mr. Edu and all our panelists for a very rich discussion on the issue of fiscal space and financial sustainability. We will now proceed to have the last roundtable discussions. Under this session, we will be discussing the role of private sector and the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. The session will be chaired by His Excellency, Mr. Mukhtar Wuldija, Minister of Economy and Finance for Mauritania. Excellency, you have the floor. Yeah.
I'll lose my job. Huh? If I do that, by the time I get to the office, they'll say, we have dismissed you from your job.
No. No. Yes, tell them it's very complicated. I have simplified and
they'll say, oh, you're fired.
What does it mean? All these are so interesting, and you are part of it.
Are you ready? Okay.
Merci, Excellence, Monsieur le Président. Excellence, Madame la Secrétaire exécutive Vera Sangway, Mesdames, Messieurs les ministres, Mesdames, Messieurs les invités, c'est toujours un grand plaisir de rencontrer ce groupe de décideurs et de personnes averties pour débattre de l'avenir de notre continent et plus précisément du rôle que devra jouer le secteur privé dans la mise en œuvre de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine. Donc, très heureux de présider cette importante table ronde et de faire en compagnie de ce groupe d'éminents intervenants. Un grand merci à la CA pour avoir programmé et facilité ce débat de haut niveau. Mais avant de commencer, je voudrais dire quelques mots sur le thème de notre débat, le secteur privé et la mise en œuvre de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, pour les mettre dans son contexte et poser quelques questions pour orienter le débat. À mesure que les négociations sur les autres aspects de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine se poursuivent, le rôle du secteur privé dans la mise en œuvre de la zone est mis en bonne place dans ces négociations. Compte tenu de l'objectif prioritaire que constitue l'industrialisation pour la transformation structurelle et le développement inclusif visé, la consultation du secteur privé, y compris des entreprises du secteur manufacturier, sera essentielle. Ces consultations devront permettre de recenser les possibilités prioritaires d'accès des entreprises africaines au marché en Afrique. La crainte a été exprimée que la ZLEC puisse être mise à profit par les entreprises non africaines pour évincer le secteur privé africain en s'établissant dans un pays africain et en utilisant cette présence pour entrer sur le reste du marché panafricain. Dans le même temps, le permettre à des filiales ou des succursales d'entreprises étrangères d'accéder au marché unifié de la ZLEC pourrait contribuer à attirer de nouveaux investissements. La conception de la zone de libre-échange continentale doit donc trouver le juste équilibre entre la nécessité d'attirer les investissements et celle de veiller à ce que les possibilités que crée la zone en premier lieu aux Africains. Cela pourrait être en s'assurant que les avantages de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine se limitent aux entreprises qui répondent à certains
meeting certain criteria beyond simple presence in Africa, so that the CFTA should be a success. The private sector in Africa will have to benefit from the possibilities offered by the CFTA. For example, the extension towards new markets, in particular going beyond free trade areas and regional economic groupings in which the private sector can be involved in many cases. As to small and medium enterprises, they can concentrate on the provisions to large enterprises who can benefit from the new possibilities for export offered by the CFTA.
Those companies which produce the primary raw products can see how far they're able to add value to their product before exporting them, and the private sector should play a role in the modernization of infrastructure across Africa and the provision of services, logistic and marketing-wise, to facilitate the possibilities for Africans by the CFTA. It should also invest massively in the training of human resources so that we're able to take full advantage of the opportunities that will be created thanks to the implementation of the AFCFTA. The objective of this roundtable is to respond to certain key questions. First of all, how can African countries bring together the private sector to the process of the implementation of the AFCFTA? The second question, how can Africa find the right balance between using the AFCFTA across the continent and the need to make sure that Africans are the primary beneficiaries of this free trade area? How can African governments and how should they support the private sector in exploiting the huge market created by this free trade area? And how can the private sector be associated to the infrastructure across Africa to allow the continent to have the greatest benefit possible from the AFCFTA? I would like now to present the speakers who will debate on this theme with me. Firstly, Mrs. Hope Tumukunde Gazatura, Ambassador of the Republic of Rwanda to Ethiopia. Mr. the Special Counselor for Africa, Ms. Gawanas, and the Chief Economist of the African Development Bank, Hippolyte Fofak. I now would like to give the floor to the first speaker to give the keynote speech. She will have 5 minutes. Mr. Rosen will have 5 minutes. He is the chairman of the Rail Working Group.
Madam Executive Secretary, dear Vera, Mr. Chairman, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, distinguished delegates, it's an enormous privilege for me to be addressing you today on a subject which will make a practical contribution to intra-African trade and Africa's sustainable development agenda, and it will save you money. I represent the Rail Working Group, a global association of stakeholders in the private sector focused on the railways, from operators to manufacturers, financiers, and specialist advisors. We are focused on the adoption of the Luxembourg Rail Protocol to the Cape Town Convention, something we all passionately believe in. It will make a real, positive, and practical contribution to hundreds of millions of people's lives. We work for free, including me. I'm here because I believe in Africa. There is a symbiotic relationship between trade and the railways. It's the only way to move goods in any serious volume, cost-effectively, both within countries and across continents. Free trade needs distribution, and the roads cannot cope. And to give you an example of the costs that are being borne at the moment, as Madam Ambassador may know, in Rwanda at the moment, it costs $4,990 to move one 20-foot container to the coast. The average in sub-Saharan Africa is $2,504. But Rwanda at the moment does not have a rail system. As you work towards your noble aspiration of free trade in Africa, it will be the railways that make it happen. And yet, I hardly need tell you, there's not enough money. There's not enough money for renewing infrastructure. There's not enough money for developing new projects and building new lines. There's not enough money to invest in rolling stock, which is not just desperately needed to replace and enhance often very old equipment or to support new projects, but will be especially important as Africa moves towards introducing standard gauge rail lines across the continent, in turn facilitating regional and continental integration of economies. Today, investment in rolling stock in Africa only represents about 7% of the total spend on rolling stock in the world, and it's going down as a percentage. The cost of rolling stock can amount to about 1/3 of the total cost of any new rail project. Until now, this cost has usually been directly paid or underwritten by states using precious resources. Where non-recourse private finance is available, it's too expensive because of the perceived risks. But for the first time, there's an alternative. The Luxembourg Protocol is a new international treaty on the recognition and prioritization of security interests held by private sector creditors lending on or leasing railway equipment. These security interests will be registered in an international registry in Luxembourg, which will be searchable 24/7 through the internet. It will also introduce, for the first time, the idea of a unique global numbering system for railway equipment. It doesn't exist at the moment, and that will be an important practical issue as railways integrate. When it comes into force, the protocol will make it easier and cheaper for the private sector to finance all railway rolling stock. And according to a recent report which we published in 20 states across Europe, the economic benefit, purely a direct microeconomic benefit, is estimated at 19.4 billion euros. Next month, we will publish another study just relating to South Africa, which estimates the benefit of 1.5 billion. This does not even try to quantify the macroeconomic benefits. The Cape Town Convention itself, an African invention, and the Aircraft Protocol is already in force for 12 years. It's been adopted by 71 states, including 21 in Africa, for whom the adoption of the Luxembourg Protocol should be very easy. And we expect that it will go into force in ratifying states next year. However, at the moment, it has only been ratified by one African state, Gabon, and signed by Mozambique. And surely this is a missed opportunity. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, we urge your states to sign and then ratify the Luxembourg Protocol as quickly as possible. It will open the way for private sector, domestic and foreign investment in the railways and remove a major financial burden for government, freeing up resources for other urgent priorities. But there's more. By underwriting secured financing without state guarantees, not only will the protocol ensure more attractive financing rates, but it will give more latitude to public and private operators alike to invest in rolling stock when the need arises, not when the funds are available. The protocol will cost governments nothing except the time of the procedure to adopt the protocol, and the Rail Working Group promises to be there with you as you work through that process. But the opportunities, the investment and the cost savings the protocol will bring for Africa will be immense. This is a valuable new practical tool to support free trade and sustainable development in Africa. And we urge you not just to grasp this tool as soon as you can, but to embrace it together, to support the resolution that we move forward and have one common system for railways in Africa. With your backing, the Luxembourg Protocol will create a new and cheaper resource for the private sector to urgently support needed investment in railways across Africa. It will protect operators and shippers, as well as financiers and other investors as the rolling stock moves across borders, allowing both the railways to literally deliver the goods and to ensure that we can have an efficient and cheaper free trade system with Africa, that we can relieve government of the finance burden of rolling stock, that we can support environmentally sustainable growth and create more jobs and wealth throughout the continent, and that Africa can achieve its true economic potential. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Rosin, pour l'exposé riche d'enseignements et pour avoir présenté aussi de manière claire certaines...
Some of the major questions that are involved. I now turn to our other speakers and invite them to make brief statements of about 3 minutes to respond to the presentation and to the theme of this particular roundtable. Madam Hope Tumukunde Gazatura, how can African countries involve the private sector in the process under negotiation of the AFCFTA?
I wish, first of all, to thank Dr. Vera for giving me this opportunity to share, especially my thoughts on how the private sector can be associated in the CFTA implementation. First of all, the role of the private sector in implementing the CFTA is of paramount across Africa, and especially because the AFCFTA was designed primarily for the private sector, and of course the obligation lies on the governments of member states, but primarily it was designed for the private sector. And regarding this very important question that the chair raised on how the government should involve the private sector in the ongoing negotiations, first of all, the involvement of private sector is it's a very necessary condition for a successful implementation of the AFCFTA, because this is a sector that have been living the continental trade, of course, under different hardships, and therefore governments have to make sure that, first of all, on one side, the private sector understands fully the meaning of the AFCFTA, and of course consults the private sector along the journey, as the journey of negotiation, especially since these hardships that the private sector have been implementing, living can inform the whole journey of negotiations. Therefore, there is need for intensive awareness of the private sector, of the benefit of the CFTA, to allow the private sector to realize how they are the biggest and primary beneficiaries. And this could be done, for example, through business fora like that held in Kigali on the sidelines of the CFTA summit. And also, and of course, it can be done at different levels, regional, national, and subnational. And this can also it can also be done through PPDs, public-private dialogues on CFTA especially, and of course at different levels. And in Rwanda, especially after the signing of the agreement on March 21st, a national technical negotiation team was put in place. And among other things, the team was mandated to increase the awareness and understanding of the public, especially in the private sector, on the CFTA agreement, together with other trade-related frameworks, especially their implication and benefit among business community and different groups, women groups and youth groups. And also a detailed work program was put in place such that it would accompany the whole journey. All this will help create the required social consensus on opening up, without which the things, will be, earlier on we were discussing on the whole question of social consensus as presented by the governor of the National Bank of Ireland. If I may add a little bit of how can the government, of course, support the private sector, because without first ratification of the CFTA and, of course, the protocol on free movement, because both of them go closely together, hand in hand, and therefore first ratification of the two would mean that the private sector would take benefit of the ratifications of both instruments. And also governments can do reforms, especially towards easing doing business for small and big, and for local and foreign private sector businesses. For example, in Rwanda, we have done around 41 doing business reforms over the past 10 years, and we'll continue to review such policies and put in place progress to reform where reform is required, especially to improve on the cross-border performance indicators. This is because Rwanda strongly believes in the regional and continental integration as an important factor to economic growth, and also in a private sector-led economy. So also government can put in place CFTA strategies to identify key trade opportunities, especially in sectors where respective countries have comparative advantages, and implementation of regional policies that can support. If I may cite one example in the Eastern African region, is that the implementation of the single custom territory is in the recent Northern Corridor report of the single customs territory showed that clearance time for cargo destined from Kampala from Mombasa to Kampala reduced from 18 days to 4 days, and from 21 days to 6 days for cargo going to Kigali. This has reduced not only on the time spent, but of course also on the cost of transport that my colleague was just mentioning earlier on. So maybe let me leave it at this. I can always add on later. Thank you, Chair.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Gastera. Je donne maintenant la parole à Monsieur Admissi d'Addis.
According to you, how can Africa find the exact balance between the use of the CFTA to encourage new investment across the continent and the necessity to make sure that Africans are the prime beneficiaries from this free trade area? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. It's a very interesting question because striking a right balance is not always easy. But I think there is a mix of measures that one can consider to find that elusive optimal point. One would be, of course, how we define procurement. Procurement can be seen in the context of regional value chains, and we can find a way to encourage our policymakers and regulators to define norms for how Pan-African enterprises will operate, especially large enterprises that get access to regional markets. One can have measures that actually enhances the whole push towards regional value chains. That would allow countries to specialize and to participate in the process of agglomeration. So I think procurement, the whole manner in which one does procurement is going to be very key. And that procurement can also have a softer side to it, where one does local economic development, combines it with an element of enterprise development, so that big Pan-African enterprises that take advantage of these integrated markets can actually also work with local suppliers on smaller inputs. So clearly, procurement is going to be very key. There was always a question as to what constitutes a Pan-African enterprise. That can get very complex, but one can always look at a measure of metrics that looks at empowerment to ensure that even if it's a global corporation operating in Africa, one can say, well, to what extent are you promoting skills development, training, employing young people, ensuring that there's a healthy mix of African managers and professionals involved in the enterprise. So there's a number of ways in which one can also provide a healthy encouragement to large-scale enterprises that would actually empower Africans and enable a deeper and more meaningful participation. At the level of ownership as well, one can also promote the concept of widely held Pan-African enterprises. It can be through dual listings, multiple listings in stock markets, to encourage Pan-African enterprises to issue bonds in local currencies, to also allow small-scale participation in investments in the enterprise as well. One can have retail bonds, one can have small-scale equity opportunities. One can also have other ways of promoting ownership of African institutions. And so there's many ways of also addressing the issue of ownership without creating too much complication to investors, of course, who wouldn't want to face too many of these kinds of issues. So it's again a question of the optimal point. Different countries have experimented with different models. The outcomes are mixed, but I think one can actually have a very focused research project on this to see how best to design a meaningful mix of measures. I think a lot has been said in the earlier session around development of capital markets. I think local capital markets have a long way to go, and that really has a great deal to offer. The region, we have tested it alongside IFC. One of the countries we've had a very interesting local issue was Tanzania, where we managed to issue a 32 billion Tanzanian shilling bond that was immediately invested back into infrastructure in the same country. And it was a very large issue, one of the largest issues in the local capital market. We had to get special dispensations to actually do such a big issue. But the regulators were very comfortable because they realized that all the money was going right back into the same economy. So it wasn't a question of taking it across borders. In the context of a Pan-African integrated market, what does bond issuances mean? You may have some countries that actually are regional markets, regional hubs. There's a lot of possibility for having regional capital market issues. The East African community has experimented with a regional authority that would facilitate this. But there is a great deal, I think, that needs to be done on the financial side of things, because once we get the institutional issues resolved, I think finance can flow. But we all know that there's a huge gap in terms of financing. The issue of harnessing African capital is very real. Getting savings rates up is a big issue. But no matter how we address it, there will always be a huge gap that requires external financing. And the question is, how do we actually do it sustainably? And we all tend to always look at debt as being the way of attracting foreign capital. But clearly, foreign direct investment is one other way. And there can be many innovative ways of actually attracting foreign direct investment, including from the diaspora. The African diaspora outside has very significant sums of capital. They could easily come into the continental opportunities, bringing hard currency and also bringing the skills and the experience that goes with that. I think there's been some successful cases of harnessing that kind of capital, but we are just beginning that process, and I think there's much to be said on that.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Tadesse. Je pense que l'équilibre.
Yes, I think that balance was found through that very relevant response. It's a critical question, such as the one that we were first asking. Ms. Gowanas, I have a question for you. How can African governments support the private sector in exploiting the great single market that we will then have on the African continent? You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and may I say also thanks to the chairperson of the Bureau of the Conference of Ministers, my sister, the executive secretary. I've come all the way from New York to join you because we both have recently taken up our positions within the UN system, but I also just wanted to be here. I want to change the narrative a little bit. And I want to speak to that private sector that is sometimes so invisible. And it is the private sector that has, for the longest of time that I know, fed the people of this continent. The private sector of women who had been building resilient communities through sitting out there in the market and trading. I'm speaking of a private sector that is composed of youth. And I guess we are looking at the purpose of the free trade agreement, and we had talked about who are the beneficiaries. I want to believe that the beneficiaries ultimately are the people of Africa, and especially those most vulnerable and marginalized. And so when we talk about how can government involve the private sector, I am saying that the private sector is diverse. It's very easy to involve the big firms because they have chambers of commerce. The problem that we have is when we want to involve the informal sector, when we want to involve the smallholder farmers, when we want to involve the women out there in the informal economy, that is going to be our challenge. Where is it that they will find their voice? Where is it that they will give an input so that they are not lost as we are moving forward in terms of the free trade agreement? So yes, governments can do a lot. Governments can make sure that when we are looking at supporting the private sector, that it is not going to be a shoe that fits all, but that there will be tailored packages of support to the different sectors as they exist in the diversity of the private sector. I also want to say that we have always talked about questions of access to finance, access to information, access to easy regulations of those that are in the informal sector. And I think that will still apply as we move into the broader market, and I don't think we should leave that out. We are talking about vulnerabilities. How many times have we seen traders, informal traders, being beaten up, their properties taken away from them? How are we going to protect them within the bigger market? We are talking about youth. Now, we can give them the skills, we can give them the training, but what African youth need is a mindset that they can also be employers, a mindset that say that they don't always need to be employees. And I know that at this point in time, youth are the ones that are the innovators. They are the ones, and as they always say, we know how to accelerate, so give it to us and we will run, because we run fast. But in this changing landscape in which we are moving forward, we need leadership. We need governance of our natural resources. We need ministries to talk to each other. The environment ministries, the agricultural ministries, all those ministries are important in terms of policy setting and implementation. But also, we talked during the last 2 days about illicit financial flows. We talked about corruption. Now, if we want to level the playing field, and especially bring out those that have always been invisible in the marketplace, then we need to deal with these issues. Because these are what is most likely going to undermine any efforts at leveling the playing field. And here I'm speaking about those that should not be left behind. So I can only say, as many have said, having worked for the African Union for 9 years, and having sat through many times of decision-taking, that time has come for Africa to implement. The African people have heard what our leaders have said. They have said we are creating a market that will deliver food, a market that will deliver a better living standard. If we should fail to implement it, the African people would lose hope. Thank you.
Monsieur Fofak, comment le secteur privé peut-il être associé à la modernisation des infrastructures de l'Afrique pour permettre au continent de tirer? Ah, d'accord. Excusez-moi, donc je n'ai pas ouvert le micro.
I hadn't turned on my mic. Apologies. Mr. Fofak, I would like to put to you the following question. How can the private sector be associated with the modernization of infrastructure in Africa so that the continent is able to have the very best opportunities through the AFCFTA? Thank you.
Your moderating sessions. I would like to, first of all, thank Dr. Vera Songwe, the Executive Secretary, and to welcome and thanks Honorable Minister in the room for being part of these sessions. I also like to thank Dr. Vera Songwe for associating the African Export-Import Bank to this important session, ministerial session, to explore options for accelerating implementation of the CFTA. And I have to say that focusing on the private sector, it's a very important and very rational choice to make, especially given what has happened in the world, especially since the end of the Cold War, where the increasing reliance on private sector-led growth has become a generalized model. We've seen even communist China embracing the private sector, with at time the successful Chinese corporation private sector crowding out the African private sector to become essentially Africa's largest single trading partners. And before China, we had, of course, European countries such as France and Britain playing that same role. And to go back to the question asked by the chair, one should ask, what are these countries actually exporting to Africa? What is Africa importing from these countries? And the answer is very simple. Africa is essentially importing manufactured goods, those that we are not able to produce locally, which make it clear what the African private sector should do to make sure that CFTA is a success. In fact, if you go back 60 years ago, and Kwame Nkrumah put it right, we've become poor because we produce what we do not consume and consume what we do not produce. So the African private sector could actually address this issue by essentially producing what we consume. But essentially, by taking that step, we will see this as a win-win approach in the sense that as the private sector thrives under the CFTA, we could see them broadening the tax base to create more fiscal space and allowing African government to do even more in terms of infrastructure development. At the same time, by producing the goods and services for export, the African private sector will be playing a key role at actually integrating Africa into the global economy, in essence, addressing the chronic and structural balance of payment deficit, which have set country, as said earlier, on path to debt unsustainability. One key question we have now is that clearly the involvement of the private sector in CFTA implementation will generate a win-win model, which is good for the private sector. We take advantage of economies of scale under the CFTA. It's also good for African government from the standpoint of fiscal revenue, but also foreign reserve generations. The key question therefore becomes, what should be done to make sure that that win-win model becomes successful during implementations? And we have a number of issues that one may consider to support the private sector in that regard. One of the key issues is the issue of financing. We've all heard about the financing gap for infrastructure, which on average annually it's large in excess of 93 billion, and we consider as an underestimations. So raising financing for private sector will be key, not just for infrastructure, but also for the private sector itself. And I would like to point here that when you compare Africa to other regions of the world, and credit to private sector in Africa is about 46%, against almost 100% within the Eurozone, and 156% in China. It's quite clear that the private sector cannot thrive and respond to the challenge of the CFTA without the financing. Another important aspect that one should mention is the issue of trade finance and financing intra-African trade. Trade financing gap is also huge. And what we've done here specifically as an institutions, the African Export-Import Banks, and to respond to the question raised earlier on correspondent banking, virtually created an open credit line amounting to almost $800 million to 55 African banks across the continent. We intend to actually extend that to cover 500 banks by 2021, addressing the constraint of correspondent banking associated with exit of large banks. The African Export-Import Bank is also investing heavily into direct financing of African trade, intra-African trade. We have set the goal of increasing our financing intra-African trade to $25 billion by 2021 when we come to the end of our current implementation plan. I would also like to go back to the point raised earlier by my colleague on the issue of trade informations. And it's quite clear that the constraint to trade information in particular, is a major challenge for the growth of intra-African trade. And to respond to that challenge, the African Export-Import Bank, in partnership with the African Union Commissions and the government of the Arab Republic of Egypt, have taken the option to establish the inaugural intra-African trade fair, which will be held by the Egyptian government later this year, December 11, 17, 2018, essentially to provide trade and market informations and connect supplier and buyer across the continents. It will be a very important milestone in the process of CFTA implementations, and we expect more than 1,000 exhibitors and 70,000 visitors as part of that effort. At the same time, other constraint that one may address to respond to the question raised by the chair is developing industrial park and special economic zone to alleviate supply-side constraint and ultimately establish vibrant regional value chain as well as supply chain needed to actually promote industrializations and enhance integration of African economies. And the bank has made a commitment to establish 500 hectares of such park by the end of the plan. And quite frankly, the support of African private sector is not just in the area of financing, but it should also go beyond and look at the advocacy space. In particular, to have one bloc, as discussed earlier, does not preclude challenge of facing the European Union or the US under the AGOA arrangement. In that case, it would be very important to create a platform where the African private sector could actually participate and contribute to trade negotiation between the African continent and foreign partner in a way that will actually strengthen the bargaining power of the continent as a whole. In that regard, we've been working with the African Union to establish what we call the Pan-African Private Sector Trade Investment Committee to essentially enhance the participations of African private sector to trade negotiations and investment policy formulations. Quite frankly, as said earlier, the CFTA implementation and its successful implementation require a real mental shift to move away from a model of resource extractions to a model which emphasizes essentially structural transformation, industrial development. And thus far, the development model has been one of excessive reliance on import of manufactured goods. And the costs and consequence of that model are increasingly obvious. One can mention structural balance of payment crisis, but also the fact that the rising African populations to almost 2.5 billion by 2050 will make such a model unsustainable. How many cars can we import every year at that scale? And the real challenge for Africa lies, therefore, in escaping from that old models. And the CFTA, in our view, provide a great, if not unique, opportunity to really accelerate transformation of African economies. And I would like to end this session by quoting John Maynard Keynes, who once said or wrote, "The difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas as in escaping from old ones." The old ones for us have been excessive reliance on resource extractions. We now have to shift toward supporting structural transformation, industrializations. We believe the private sector under the CFTA will thrive if all these conditions are put together. Thank you.
Donc voilà, je remercie tous les intervenants de leurs observations. Je pense que nous pouvons.
Thank you. I think that we can now open up our discussions. We have around 20 minutes available to us. I would like to ask the honourable delegates to keep their statements short so that we are able to take a certain number of questions. Are there any questions from the floor, please?
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Misela Ndlapo, Mrs. Private Sector. I represent the Railroad Association. We are an organization that is based in South Africa. We have private-public partnership with Department of Trade and Industry. And our main objectives of supporting the Luxembourg Protocol is that as a manufacturing sector, we are suffering because of the types of funding that has been made available to our governments. The funding has a stranglehold relationship with our governments. It's funding in the form of a loan. They bring labor, they bring equipment.
We know that we have people in Africa that are unemployed. We have poverty in Africa. So what do I tell an unemployed African men and women and the youth? What do we do with the unemployment if we grow other economies, not our economy? So I plead with the delegates to consider the African child when we make policy. We need to look to the private sector to have more options and perhaps dictate terms when we get funding for our projects. Private sector is here. I've said it before yesterday, that if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, private sector is here. We're good at implementation. Please use us. Thank you.
Le Niger, Madame la Ministre.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre, cher frère.
Thank you to all the panelists for their statements. They were very enlightening, especially on the impact of the CFTA on the private sector in our countries. I would have liked to have heard a bit more about what my sister said on vulnerable populations, because they will be affected by the implementation of the AFCFTA. And often they're in the informal sector. In our country, in the private sector, they're also in the informal sector. And in this informal sector, you can find women and you find young people, especially. The question of economic empowerment of women is essential within this stage, as well as the issue of empowering youth through employment. They are the great drivers of this informal sector and for cross-border trade and commerce as well, amongst other things. However, we know that the economic empowerment of women can have an impact on our projects. Finally, on 8th of March, there was a declaration by the Ivory Coast who said that thanks to the empowerment of women, $6 billion could be generated. Mediterranean countries are convinced, in fact, that GDP can increase by 25% if women are empowered. In India, this figure would stand at 8%. So we have this opportunity to increase our GDP. And by extension, we have an opportunity to increase our wealth and our capacity to mobilize internal resources to grow our economy, etc. Therefore, I'd like for us to take this opportunity. I'll be brief, even though I could say the same for youth and their employability. But the economic empowerment of women, I think, is very important. We therefore need a different strategy for this, because that will also contribute to the promotion of the private sector and for growth as well. Thank you. Côte d'Ivoire, you have the floor. Thank you, Chair, for giving us the floor. First of all, I would like to thank all of the panelists. Thank you for your presentations. I have two concerns. Firstly, when we talk about the private sector, I find it slightly difficult to understand what sector we're really talking about. We know that in most of our countries, a lot of the economy, in fact, escapes the national level. So what private sector are we talking about? Will the implementation of this free trade area truly enable national companies? When I say national companies, I mean companies with a national capital led by nationals. So will this free trade area really benefit these companies, or will it once more just be a way for foreign companies to invest their capital and to take that capital once again abroad? So lots of our countries do have quite high GDPs and high growth in terms of 8%, 9%. But the problem is redistribution, so what remains within the country. We believe that a national private sector would really enable the invested capital to stay within the country. That's my first concern. My second concern relates to what the representative of Afexibank said. When we talk about SMEs, how can they increase their capacity so that they can then invest, increase capacity with regards to the implementation of the AFCFTA? Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Benin, please. Thank you, Chair. The delegation of Benin would like to congratulate you. Congratulations on the excellent way in which you have led this roundtable discussion. In particular, we would like to touch upon the issue of how the private sector can be involved in financing the modernization of Africa. During our work here, we're seeing a cross-cutting analysis of data on the mobilization of fiscal resources. This showed that the trend for public aid for development and saw remittances as well. We see that remittances were actually higher than ODA in Africa. And this was an idea set out by a communicator earlier when they said that the African diaspora has capital. Mr. Mofak touched upon the issue of the implementation of special economic zones. We need a new approach for these zones. Our states tend to implement these zones in order to attract foreign investment. It would seem more appropriate within the context of this AFCFTA to create special zones for the African private sector, because we need to develop African trade. And the great challenge today is to mobilize African investment for African trade. That's my statement. Thank you. Madam, I can't read your flag, but you have the floor. Senegal, please. Thank you very much, Chair, for giving me the floor. I would also like to thank the panelists for sharing their experiences and for responding to our comments. As you know, for 3 days now, we've been talking about the involvement of the private sector in financing the infrastructure which will be required for the implementation for this free trade area. With regards to the development of national strategies, many countries are developing public-private partnerships to finance infrastructures. My concern, though, is that we don't really master these public-private partnerships and exemptions, issues of taxing as well. There's often a lot of issues which arise, and so public-private partnerships has an impact on governments and can increase debts often, because often companies are given guarantees. If they're local companies, this can come into play for contracts. So often there's several people bidding above each other, and this can have a great impact on public debt. Public debt is increasing, and between 30 and 60% of GDP at the moment in many countries. So we need to look at budgetary margins as well. Within this dynamic, can governments have a sufficient budgetary margin to do this? Due to this debt increase, is there another strategy in terms of public-private partnerships which would prevent these increases in debts? We also have debt viability and the analysis of other strategies. So budgetary risks of PPPs is often not analysed, though, by our states within these partnerships. So I'd like to hear guidance on this from member states. Thank you. I see no more questions. Therefore, who would like to take the floor in order to respond to some of these comments and questions?
To take the question from Ivory Coast, and which I found very pertinent. I would like to thank Honourable Minister for their contribution. I think the key question was whether we actually have an African private sector, which is a fair question. If you look at the African logistical infrastructure, whether it is port, railways, and so forth, it's still largely controlled by foreign entities, multinational corporations. If you take even the sensitive areas such as telecommunications and so forth, we have the same challenge. And we believe that the CFTA actually will provide the opportunity for the domestic African private sector to grow. And of course, it is not a given, and especially given the bias in the competitive space. We may still have a model whereby Chinese or even corporations in Asia are more competitive, they are still more competitive than African economies, and which will pose a number of challenges in terms of WTO rulings. But what is quite sure is that if we have, under the CFTA, with the right policy in terms of raising the competitiveness of African economies in the area of infrastructure, in the area of monetary policy arrangement and so forth, we could actually create a vibrant and domestic private sector that will be able to thrive and compete globally. And I think we've outlined a number of issues that will have to be addressed. We have infrastructure, but also access to credit in a competitive setting. Another important question that was raised by the Ivorian delegate was actually the role that the credit, access to credit will play in enhancing the contribution of African private sector to the process of economic transformations, which is what will make the CFTA works for all. And it is a key challenge. As I said in my opening remark, access to credit has been singled out year after year as a key constraint to private sector development in the regions. If you look at the surveys carried out, it is an issue, and which will have to be addressed even by central banks, which have to actually, in new models, to, instead of putting emphasis on inflation targeting, to shift toward a dual objective for central bank, looking at both macro stability or low inflation, but also the promotions of growth. And that has been the model for most central banks, whether it is the ECB, the European Central Bank, or the US Federal Reserve. So I think the overemphasis on the single inflation target may have been achieved at the expense of growth of private sector development. We saw the figure, private sector growth, to private sector credit to private sector credit to private sector in China is more than 150% against about 45% for African countries. At Afreximbank, we've actually been looking at this from the standpoint of providing direct credit to African private sector operator. we are wholesale banks, which tend to emphasize large cooperation within the continent, but we've also been providing access to credit, financing to small African SMEs through what we call our trade finance intermediaries. In other words, we have a number of African banks across the continent, which are our TFI intermediary. We provide line of credit to large African banks, and through that operation, they are therefore able to provide direct credit to SME, to small Africans and growing African corporations. But we realize that even that is not enough for, especially in a continent, we need startup. There are many dreams which simply vanish and disappear because of lack of access to credit. It's much easier to support an existing SMEs than actually providing the financing for a non-existing startup. So what the bank has done recently, under the leadership of President Orama, the board of the African Export-Import Bank approved what we call Fund-Fed, Fund for Export Development, which will provide financing for young African startups involved in structural transformation of African economies. It is a major initiative. We realize that in new and young economies, it's very easy for an African Export-Import Bank, for an Exim Bank, to actually support the status quo. That we're financing the export of road commodities. In mature economies such as the US, Exim Bank can essentially look at financing. They will have Boeing or Lockheed Martins to actually finance. But in the African context, it's very important for an African Exim Bank to also invest directly into industrialization and structural transformations. And we believe that Fund-Fed, Fund for Export Development, will help grow the emergence of new African startups. Hopefully, some of these will become will emerge to become the Bill Gates of tomorrow, the Apples of tomorrow. I think we are very confident that on the level playing field, African entrepreneur will just be as successful. Thank you, Chair.
Autre réaction?
Yes. No, just very quickly, I thought it might be useful just to say that the macro strategy of an integrated continental market doesn't necessarily come into conflict with local enterprise development or the African private sector, indigenously speaking. Because what happens is if you design smart policies and smart regulations, you can create a situation where the global foreign direct investment that comes in actually creates backwards and forwards linkages to actually stimulate input markets from the local economies and support regional value chains. We live in an age now where global value chains dominate. So I think it would be very unwise for us to think that Africa can do it on its own. I think Africa has to find a way to participate in global markets, take advantage of technology, and take advantage of big capital worldwide. The truth is that when you look at the external financing requirements of our region, it will always be a case where we're looking at $200 to $300 billion per annum being the gap. So we have to embrace international capital. The question is the how. How do we embrace it? How do we make sure that it creates these linkages? Because it's all about the linkages. It's all about the in-betweens, right? So I think somehow we need to look at issues of regional value chains, procurement, and then I think in the agribusiness space, there's huge opportunities for the small African private sector to demand more by way of commodity exchanges and better infrastructure to enable the primary production to actually move its product safely, having warehouse systems in place, cold storage. A colleague spoke about rail. Rail is great and it's badly needed, but without the warehouse infrastructure to support it, to ensure that the multimodal transport systems are designed in a way that you can move the product from one mode of transport to the next, the whole issue of ports, the whole issue of security of goods in transit. Very, very important, because that is where actually a lot of African small-scale players get hurt. They get hurt because you can't move your product. Sometimes it just has to do with customs procedures. I think Vera this morning very eloquently talked about the soft institutional issues, very long delays in terms of getting documentation through. I saw a report where one regional supermarket company had to have 1,600 documents for one shipment of goods across borders. 1,600 documents. Now, if a formal company has to comply with that kind of burden of compliance and regulation, imagine how a small player has to actually cope. So there's a lot of soft institutional issues, I think, that need to be addressed to help the small African private sector. I think lastly speaking, we also need to bear in mind that the extractive industries are currently configured in such a way that it's very difficult for the smaller African private sector to get access to copper, to nickel, to chrome, to iron ore, to do small-scale industrial projects within countries. We've had experiences where we've given loans of $5 to $10 million to small steel manufacturers and to some who wanted to do the same with copper and the same with chrome. But the way our extractive industries are organized, it doesn't allow local players to get access to raw materials. So there's a lot of issues around the how. It's not the what or the if, it's the how. And we need smart policies to ensure that Africans are not being disintermediated from the process of value addition, because value addition is the whole game. That is why we're looking at this integrated continental market. It's about enabling structural transformation. But for us to industrialize, we need to make sure that we can add value to our resources. Our resources, in many cases, are primary products, but if all of them are being locked up and shipped globally, and there's no access to add value locally, that's a problem. So I think there's a lot of soft issues that need to be highlighted as well.
Mr. Chair, I think we are very much in pressure of time, so if we can speed up the process, thank you.
Just to add, to say something about the PP model that Senegal raised, I think this fits properly into how the private sector can be involved, especially in the Africa's required infrastructure. It all depends on the terms that the partnership is agreed upon, and especially having in mind the African people, especially the vulnerable people. So the partnerships are not bad themselves. It all depends on the side of Africa and even the private sector. For example, I would give two examples. My government, Rwanda, entered into a PPP agreement with a private company to construct a new international airport. But of course, the terms matters, the details of the terms would matter. And also, I'm sure here in Ethiopia, how similarly the government of Ethiopia worked with private companies in the construction of the railway, the Djibouti Ethiopian railway. So the partnerships are very important. It gives an opportunity for the private sector to be involved. The most important thing, whether the African private sector or even foreign, the most important is the terms that are agreed upon by, of course, our governments and whoever is involved. Thank you. That's just.
Madam Gowanas.
Thank you very much. I will just give some bullet points. I wish we had more time to expand a little bit on it. I think we should just recognize that the gendered nature of business or the gendered nature of the economy. So that the challenges that women currently are facing at national level, we hope that we are not going to export it to the continental level and that we will be able to deal with it. So I mean, I am here thinking about the cultural and creative industries. How many women are today informal traders taking these, their crafts across borders? But because they don't have money to add value to it and increase the prices of it, we go to markets and we negotiate with our own people the cheapest prices, because these are not products that are produced in a factory. It's produced by hand. That is one of the issues that I think needs to be addressed. The second issue for me is, at this point in time, one needs to ask oneself, where exactly is the private sector situated, in what type of industries? And I've heard a lot of people talking about we need to diversify. We need to move to make our agricultural production, increase our agricultural production, because that's also where the majority of our people are. So I would really plead for it. But finally, I would say, at this point in time, and I don't know whether that is the case with other countries, but a lot of people at this point in time rely on government tenders, on procurement. And because they rely on procurement, in some countries they come to be known as tenderpreneurs, because they don't go beyond applying for tenders. And once they get the tenders, they don't necessarily invest in business. But, we have seen in Africa, especially young men like to flash. So they drive the latest Ferraris. So it's a mindset issue that I was talking about earlier. There are young people today that build an aeroplane, out of whatever, and we laugh at them. But is this not the potential that we should be looking at? Is this maybe not the kind of innovations that we need to take serious? But we don't take it serious. Why? Because black people cannot build planes. But maybe, yes, they can in the back of a village if we take them a little bit more seriously. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Rosin, avez-vous un mot à dire?
Thank you. I will be very brief. I just wanted to address 2 or 3 points, but very quickly. Firstly, in terms of empowerment, what instruments like the Luxembourg Protocol will do is to empower the local industry, empower local banks, empower local operators to borrow money when they need it on terms as they need it. Secondly, distribution is going to be the key to having a cost-effective and efficient and successful free trade area. We can discuss things, but if the cost of moving goods across national boundaries is high, then unfortunately it's going to mean that a lot of people suffer, particularly the poor. So an efficient distribution system, whether it's road or rail, and we would always argue it's a combination of the two, it needs to be put in place so that we have that infrastructure available to distribute our products and get products to the ports for exports as well. The third point I wanted to make very briefly was the comment on PPP. I've worked in the finance industry for close to 40 years. I know I only look 25, but actually I'm a bit older. And the first thing to bear in mind is that there are many ways to finance transactions. And unfortunately, PPP has been seen as a panacea, that you just throw a project at the private sector and they pay for it and nobody really worries about how the payments are going to be made in the end. Well, that's not correct. Unfortunately, mistakes have been made in the past with PPP. And in particular, I think that governments, with respect, have made mistakes in bringing different parties in to finance transactions at high rates when they themselves don't understand the risk. So an example of that probably would be the Gautrain project in South Africa, where you had a consortium of a builder, a train manufacturer, and an operator. But none of them actually understood the other risks they were taking, and the costs were very high. And it is an expensive program, even though it's very successful. If you left the leasing industry to take over the production and the provision of the rolling stock, leave it out of those PPP programs, I think it would be a much more efficient system and much more transparent as well. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, merci tout le monde. On va essayer de conclure sur 3 points.
By focusing on 3 points, I think that all of us agree that our dear continent is currently negotiating a watershed moment of its economic transition process. The AFCFTA is a harbinger of great hope, and we simply do not have the right to fail. I also believe that things will have to be clear. The success of this historic project cannot be achieved without strong involvement, effective involvement by the African private sector. The African private sector will have to be involved in all and every one of the stages of this project. It will have to be backed and helped to ensure that it is able to adapt to the new realities of this zone. I also believe that the AFC-FTA will have to play a decisive role in assisting our countries in this critical process. And the strategy of the ECA, I am sure, is the right tool to provide the necessary support at this level. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you all for your outstanding contributions. Thank you so much to the participants and for the very relevant ideas which were raised and voiced. And to all of you, thank you. And I thus adjourn the work of our roundtable.
I would like to thank His Excellency Mr. Mukhtar Wildeljah, Minister of Economy and Finance, Mauritania, and our panelists for a very engaging discussion on this important issue of private sector involvement. However, due to some logistical issues here, we will not have the presentation of the revised strategic framework 2018-19, and we understood that the recommendations are not yet ready in the final draft to be presented to you. So we will stop here for today, and just before that there is an announcement from the secretariat here before adjourning. Thank you.
Delegates, we apologize for the delay with the document that needed to be reviewed. In the meantime, the Secretariat, the Executive Secretary, will be hosting a reception at the exhibition concourse for delegates. So you're all invited. Thank you very much.
Thank you and good night.